Ladies and gentlemen, when we talk about finance today, we often talk as if it were a world made only of numbers. Prices, ratios, returns, volatility, interest rates, balance sheets. We speak a language that feels technical, precise, even cold. Yet beneath all of that, finance is not a machine. It is a human invention. It is shaped by choices, incentives, fears, expectations, and beliefs. And this is precisely where Adam Smith enters the conversation. Adam Smith is frequently described as the father of modern economics, but that title alone does not capture why he still matters to the financial world today. He was not trying to design markets as mechanical systems. He was trying to understand how people behave when they trade, invest, save, lend, and seek opportunity. His thinking begins not with capital, but with human nature. Smith understood something essential: finance does not exist in isolation. It grows out of production, labor, exchange, and trust. Money itself, in his view, was never the goal. It was a means, a facilitator, a tool that allowed economic activity to flow more efficiently. Confusing money with wealth, he believed, was one of the most dangerous mistakes a society could make. True wealth, for Adam Smith, came from the ability of a society to produce goods and services that improved life. Finance had value only insofar as it supported that process. Capital that circulates productively strengthens economies. Capital that merely chases itself, detached from real activity, weakens them. This idea alone places Smith in sharp contrast with certain tendencies in modern finance. He would not have been impressed by complexity for its own sake. He would not have equated sophistication with value. He would have asked a simple but uncomfortable question: what does this financial activity actually produce? Smith believed deeply in markets, but not blindly. He believed markets work best when competition is real, when entry is open, and when no single actor has the power to bend the system to their advantage. He was skeptical of monopolies, collusion, and concentrated financial power. He observed that when merchants and financiers gather, their conversations often drift toward limiting competition rather than expanding it. That observation feels remarkably current. For Smith, self-interest was not a flaw in markets. It was a given. People act in their own interest, and pretending otherwise leads to poor analysis. But self-interest needed structure. It needed rules, norms, and institutions that align private incentives with public benefit. Without that alignment, markets drift away from balance and toward exploitation. This is where the famous idea of the invisible hand is often misunderstood. Smith did not argue that markets always lead to good outcomes. He argued that under specific conditions, individual pursuit of self-interest can unintentionally promote collective welfare. Those conditions matter. Competition must exist. Information must flow. Contracts must be enforced. Fraud must be punished. Trust must be protected. Remove those conditions, and the invisible hand loses its guidance. Markets then amplify excess rather than discipline it. Adam Smith was acutely aware of risk, particularly financial risk. He did not oppose risk-taking. He saw it as essential to innovation and growth. But he distinguished clearly between productive risk and reckless speculation. Risk taken to build, to create, to expand capacity was legitimate. Risk taken purely to exploit price movements, detached from real economic activity, made him uneasy. He warned about excessive reliance on credit. He understood that credit could accelerate growth, but also that it could magnify collapse. His writing on banking shows a deep concern for systemic stability. He supported regulation where it protected the financial system from its own excesses. This is often overlooked. Smith was not an opponent of all regulation. He was an opponent of regulation that served narrow interests rather than public stability. In modern terms, Adam Smith recognized what we now call systemic risk. He understood that financial institutions, when interconnected and highly leveraged, could transmit failure across an entire economy. He believed that preventing such outcomes justified certain constraints on financial freedom. Perhaps the most overlooked part of Adam Smith's financial worldview comes from his understanding of morality. Before writing about wealth, he wrote about moral sentiments. He believed humans are not purely rational calculators. They care about reputation, fairness, and the judgment of others. These social forces shape economic behavior as much as profit does. Markets, therefore, are not morally neutral spaces. They reflect the values embedded within them. When financial systems reward short-term gain without regard for consequence, behavior adapts accordingly. When they reward patience, responsibility, and long-term thinking, behavior shifts in that direction as well. Smith believed prudence was the cornerstone of economic life. Prudence not as timidity, but as disciplined judgment. The ability to weigh future consequences against immediate reward. In many ways, prudence is the quality modern finance struggles most to preserve. If Adam Smith were observing today's financial world, he would likely admire its scale and ingenuity. He would recognize the power of capital markets to mobilize resources on an unprecedented level. But he would also be deeply concerned by how easily finance can detach itself from productive purpose. He would ask whether markets still serve society, or whether society increasingly serves markets. He would question whether innovation expands real opportunity or merely redistributes risk. He would challenge financial systems that reward speed over substance and leverage over resilience. Most importantly, he would remind us that finance is not destiny. It is design, and design reflects values. Adam Smith's enduring lesson is not that markets should be worshipped or feared, but that they should be understood. Understood as human systems, shaped by rules, incentives, and moral expectations. When aligned wisely, they generate prosperity. When neglected, they amplify inequality and instability. In the end, Adam Smith offers finance not a formula, but a mirror. A way to see how economic systems reflect who we are and what we choose to reward. And perhaps that is why, centuries later, his voice still speaks so clearly to the modern financial world. Smith was acutely sensitive to the moral dimension of economic life. Long before finance became a specialized profession, he understood that economic systems are inseparable from moral expectations. He believed that markets do not erase ethics, they reveal them. The way a financial system functions tells us what a society rewards, tolerates, and condemns. In Smith's view, individuals are not purely driven by calculation. They are influenced by reputation, by social approval, by the desire to be seen as fair and respectable. These forces, though intangible, play a powerful role in shaping economic behavior. A financial system that ignores them risks misunderstanding its own foundations. This is why Smith believed trust to be one of the most valuable forms of capital. Trust allows credit to exist. Trust allows contracts to be honored beyond immediate enforcement. Trust lowers transaction costs long before economists gave that concept a name. When trust erodes, finance becomes defensive, costly, and fragile. Smith would likely observe that modern finance often takes trust for granted while simultaneously undermining it. Excessive complexity, opaque instruments, and misaligned incentives distance financial actors from accountability. When outcomes are divorced from responsibility, confidence weakens. And without confidence, markets lose their stabilizing function. One of Smith's most enduring insights concerns prudence. He regarded prudence as the cornerstone of economic stability. Prudence, in his understanding, is not the avoidance of risk, but the disciplined evaluation of it. It is the ability to resist short-term temptation in favor of long-term security. This virtue is especially relevant in financial systems driven by immediate performance metrics. When success is measured quarterly, when compensation is tied to short-term gains, prudence becomes structurally disadvantaged. Smith would argue that such systems do not merely allow reckless behavior, they actively encourage it. He understood that incentives shape behavior more reliably than moral exhortation. Therefore, the design of financial institutions matters profoundly. Rules, norms, and expectations must align reward with responsibility. When they do not, even well-intentioned individuals may act destructively. Smith also paid close attention to the role of savings and investment. He viewed savings not as hoarded wealth, but as deferred consumption made available for productive use. Savings, when channeled into investment, expand future capacity. But when savings accumulate without productive outlets, they create imbalance. This perspective challenges a purely financialized view of capital. Capital, for Smith, was not meant to circulate endlessly within the financial sphere. It was meant to move outward, toward enterprise, labor, and innovation. Finance that feeds only itself becomes disconnected from its original purpose. Smith's skepticism toward speculation stemmed from this belief. He did not deny that speculative activity could exist, but he questioned its social value when it became dominant. Speculation that destabilizes prices, misallocates resources, or amplifies volatility without productive benefit undermines economic resilience. In today's terms, Smith might question whether financial markets increasingly price assets based on fundamentals or on expectations of expectations. He would likely be uneasy with environments where narrative outweighs substance and momentum replaces judgment. Yet it would be a mistake to imagine Smith as hostile to financial progress. He admired innovation when it expanded opportunity and efficiency. He supported financial instruments that facilitated trade and reduced friction. His concern was never innovation itself, but innovation detached from accountability. Smith recognized that finance, when properly structured, can be a powerful engine of coordination. It directs resources to their most valued uses, supports specialization, and enables growth beyond local limits. But these benefits depend on alignment between private gain and public good. When that alignment breaks, finance begins to extract rather than create. It shifts from enabling production to exploiting asymmetry. Smith saw this danger clearly in the behavior of privileged economic actors who sought advantage through political influence rather than market competition. This brings us to Smith's views on regulation, which are often misunderstood. He did not oppose regulation in principle. He opposed regulation that served special interests at the expense of competition. At the same time, he supported rules that protected the integrity of markets and the stability of the financial system. He believed that certain constraints on financial behavior were justified when they reduced systemic risk. Stability, in his view, was a public good. When financial institutions endangered that stability, intervention became not only acceptable but necessary. Smith's understanding of systemic fragility feels strikingly modern. He recognized that interconnected financial actors could transmit shocks rapidly. He understood that excessive leverage magnifies losses as easily as gains. And he knew that when confidence collapses, recovery becomes slow and painful. What Smith offers us, ultimately, is a way of thinking about finance that is neither naive nor cynical. He did not believe markets are perfect. He did not believe they are inherently corrupt. He believed they reflect the structures we build and the values we encode within them. In this sense, Adam Smith's work is not a defense of finance as it exists, but a challenge to finance as it ought to be. He invites us to ask whether our financial systems reward contribution or extraction, foresight or speed, resilience or risk-taking without consequence. If we listen carefully, Smith reminds us that finance is a means, not a measure of success. It is a tool to support productive human activity, not a scoreboard that defines worth. When finance forgets this, it grows powerful but brittle. When it remembers it, it becomes a foundation for durable prosperity. And perhaps this is why Adam Smith continues to matter. Not because he provides ready-made answers, but because he teaches us how to ask better questions. Questions that force finance to justify itself not only economically, but socially and morally. That perspective, even centuries later, remains indispensable. If we stay with Adam Smith a little longer, we begin to see that his greatest concern was not markets failing occasionally, but markets forgetting why they exist at all. He feared a world in which financial success becomes detached from social contribution, where wealth grows without corresponding improvement in collective well-being. Smith understood that financial systems shape behavior over generations. They teach people what is rewarded and what is ignored. When financial systems prioritize extraction over creation, individuals adapt. Talent flows not toward building, but toward arbitrage. Intelligence moves away from solving real problems and toward exploiting structural loopholes. Smith would recognize this pattern immediately. He was deeply aware of the difference between earning profit through productive contribution and securing advantage through positional power. The first expands opportunity, the second narrows it. Finance, in Smith's eyes, was legitimate only when it expanded the productive frontier rather than merely redistributing existing gains. This is why Smith placed such importance on enterprise. Entrepreneurs, in his view, take uncertainty and transform it into value. They commit capital, organize labor, and assume risk over time. Finance should support this process, not replace it. When financial returns become disconnected from entrepreneurial effort, something fundamental shifts. Smith would likely be concerned by financial environments where returns are increasingly generated by leverage, timing, or scale rather than insight or innovation. He would ask whether such systems truly allocate capital efficiently or simply reward proximity to financial infrastructure. Another subtle but critical aspect of Smith's thinking concerns time. He had a long-term view of economic health. Wealth was not a momentary surge but a sustained capacity. Finance, therefore, had to respect time. Investment required patience. Returns justified waiting. Excessive impatience destabilized both markets and institutions. Modern finance often compresses time. Decisions are evaluated instantly. Outcomes are judged immediately. This compression alters incentives profoundly. Smith would argue that when time horizons shrink, responsibility shrinks with them. Long-term consequences become someone else's problem. Smith also believed that inequality, when excessive, undermines markets themselves. Not out of sentimentality, but practicality. Extreme concentration of wealth distorts demand, weakens competition, and invites political capture. Finance that accelerates inequality without expanding opportunity ultimately corrodes the conditions that allow markets to function. He did not argue for equality of outcome, but for broad participation. Markets, to Smith, were healthiest when many individuals could enter, compete, and improve their circumstances. Finance that erects barriers to entry contradicts this principle. Smith's emphasis on broad participation is especially relevant in discussions of financial inclusion. Credit, when accessible and responsibly structured, empowers enterprise. When restricted to elites, it entrenches hierarchy. Smith saw access to capital as a determinant of economic dynamism. He also understood that information asymmetry creates power imbalances. When some actors possess significantly better information than others, markets tilt away from fairness. Transparency, therefore, was not merely ethical but functional. Without it, prices cease to communicate reality. Smith would likely be skeptical of financial instruments whose complexity exceeds the understanding of those who bear their consequences. He believed responsibility should accompany authority. When decision-makers are insulated from outcomes, prudence dissolves. There is also a quieter element in Smith's thought that deserves attention: restraint. Smith admired ambition, but he distrusted excess. He believed societies flourish when ambition is tempered by social norms that discourage recklessness. Finance that celebrates only accumulation risks encouraging behavior that destabilizes the very system it depends on. Smith understood that reputation matters. Financial actors care about how they are perceived. When cultures reward integrity, markets internalize discipline. When cultures reward only success regardless of method, misconduct proliferates. This cultural layer of finance is often invisible, yet profoundly influential. He would remind us that laws alone cannot sustain healthy markets. Norms matter. Expectations matter. What institutions tolerate becomes practice. What they celebrate becomes standard. If Adam Smith were observing contemporary debates about financial reform, he would likely resist extremes. He would reject the idea that markets should be left entirely unchecked. He would also reject the notion that centralized control can replace dispersed decision-making. His vision occupies a difficult middle ground: structured freedom. Freedom to compete, to innovate, to invest. Structure to prevent domination, instability, and abuse. This balance is fragile. It requires constant adjustment. Smith never believed economic systems reach a final, perfect state. Perhaps the most enduring relevance of Adam Smith lies in this humility. He did not claim to have solved economics. He offered a framework for thinking responsibly about it. He treated finance not as destiny, but as design. Design implies choice, and choice implies accountability. Smith's legacy challenges us to ask whether our financial systems reflect our highest capacities or our shortest impulses. Whether they reward patience or impatience. Whether they channel ambition toward creation or toward capture. In the end, Adam Smith does not give us comfort. He gives us responsibility. Responsibility to remember that finance is not an abstract game, but a social institution with real consequences for human lives. And as long as finance continues to shape the world as powerfully as it does, that responsibility cannot be ignored. Thank you.